Takes a couple minutes quickly. All right. Well, welcome everyone. We are so grateful that you are here with us online, Facebook Live. If you're willing and able and can share this onto your page, that way we can be sure to reach as many people as possible, the wonders of social media. Very excited to have our presenters here today. And I'm excited to be able to start by introducing myself and then introducing the other folks that are going to be with us. So my name is Susanna Tuttle, and I am the director of the North Carolina Council of Churches Eco-Justice Connection. Our North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light campaigns work to address the issues and challenges of energy justice and energy democracy across the state. Today's webinar is the first in a two-part series titled Biogas and Communities. It is our intention to educate faith communities about the problem of hog waste biogas and to amplify local community voices on the issue. Last week, we encouraged our congregational network to witness the meeting of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ's, Environmental Justice Advisory Council meeting, to hear from citizens who would be affected by hog waste, biogas technology, and permitting. This week, we will be hearing from our partners at the North Carolina Conservation Network. Sherry White-Williamson and Will Hendrick will share their expertise regarding biogas and their understandings and concerns surrounding community impacts. This webinar is streaming live on Facebook, and a recording will be available on NCIPL's YouTube page. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that here in North Carolina, as in every other part of our country, we are on Indigenous land. Our state is home to the highest Indigenous population east of Oklahoma, and acknowledging that the land we each reside within and depend upon is Indigenous land. And in one way, we seek to orient ourselves in this work and do the work of justice in our lives. Today, we honor each tribe, their ancestral land, their presence in North Carolina, and our commitment to repair the harm of the present and past. I will uplift that where I live in Western Orange County, outside of Chapel Hill, I am on the occupied lands of the Eno, Occaneechi, and Shakori Native peoples. I invite you to take a moment to name the peoples whose land you rely on now. If you do not know, this is also an invitation to learn. As for why we are gathered here today, NCIPL is a multi-faith campaign of the North Carolina Council of Churches' broader program, the Eco-Justice Connection, which focuses on environmental and climate justice. It is our mission to educate, inspire, and mobilize people of faith and conscience in this state to act on climate and justice issues as a moral imperative. This work is shared by our friends and colleagues at National Interfaith Power and Light. Here in North Carolina, we strive to do this work of educating, inspiring, and mobilizing our congregational network of more than 6,000 faith communities in a variety of ways, but by inviting congregations to think differently about food and agriculture, by investing in the work of resilience on our coast, by empowering youth climate organizers, by making climate and human health connections, by preaching and teaching around our state through conversations and actions focused on energy use, renewable energy, energy justice, and energy efficiency, and through advocacy and building relationships with our elected officials. It is in this work of advocacy, and particularly the hard and holy work of advocating with compassion, that brings us here today. And with that, I will pass it over to Susan Brooks. Susan has been serving as NCIPL's Eco-Justice Education and Advocacy Fellow this fall, and we are grateful for her passion and commitment to protect the people and places that we love. Susan has spearheaded the outreach and communication efforts that are making these biogas and community webinars possible. Passing it to you, Susan.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Susanna. I am really pleased to be here with you all. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in southeastern North Carolina in Columbus County, and went from there to be an assistant public defender, and have since worked for the state agency where we work with the underserved. And I'm feeling a call now to shift my focus a little bit to the environment, and particularly environmental justice. As I said, I grew up in southeastern North Carolina, and going from Raleigh back home, a lot of times I would pass the industrial hog farm, and you couldn't keep the odor out of your windows, out of your car. And I would hold my nose as I would drive past. And I thought, wow, I only have to endure this for a few minutes, but what if you had to live here? And when I learned that there was a proposal to turn this methane into natural gas and ship it via long pipelines, I thought, wow, what could possibly go wrong with that? So with that said, I would like to introduce our presenters who are going to tell us what would be wrong with that. First of all, our presenter and facilitator, Sherry White Williamson, is the Environmental Justice Policy Director at the North Carolina Conservation Network. And I'm going to let each of our presenters tell more about themselves. They can do a much better job than I can, but I'm just going to give a brief introduction to each of them. Will Hendrick works with Sherry as the environmental justice advocate at the North Carolina Conservation Network. And we're also very pleased to have Devon Hall, who is the co-founder and program manager of the Rural Empowerment Association for Community Help, or REACH, down in Duplin County. And he has lived this, and he can talk about that. As Susanna shared earlier, this webinar is the first in a two-part series titled Biogas and Communities. And it's our intention to educate faith communities about the problem of hog waste biogas and to amplify local community voices on the issue. I just want to thank you all for coming and learning about this issue and what we can do. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Sherry.
Thank you, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And I think I had the easy job tonight because I get to introduce myself just briefly and a little bit about the work that I do. And I'll turn it over to Will Hendrick and Devon Hall, who've been working on these issues for years. Devon for a couple of decades at this point, and they are really the experts on these issues. Just briefly, as Susan said, I'm Sherry White Williamson. I am the Environmental Justice Policy Director at the North Carolina Conservation Network. In my spare time, I co-founded an organization called the Environmental Justice Community Action Network here in Sampson County, and started working with local communities here on the issues that you all will be talking about today. I look forward to having this conversation with you. I will probably be asking questions of our two presenters during the course of this discussion, and hopefully you all will leave here tonight more educated than you were when you started this conversation with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I'm going to introduce Will Hendrick and then Devon, and then we'll start that conversation. Will Hendrick is the environmental justice advocate with the North Carolina Conservation Network. Will works to connect impacted community members and organizations with environmental decision makers. Before joining North Carolina Conservation Network, Will worked for Waterkeeper Alliance, the Southern Environmental Law Center, and the North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources. In his free time, Will enjoys kayaking, hiking, and making music. Will is an active member of Mount Carmel Baptist Church in Chapel Hill, where he sings in the choir, plays in the praise band, teaches Sunday school, and serves as the moderator of church conferences. Our second panelist is Devon Hall. Devon, as Susan said, is the co-founder and executive director of the Rural Empowerment Association for Community Help. Devon has been working on these issues for more than 20 years in Duplin County and has been the voice of reason, the voice that has kept politicians somewhat in place, and the voice of conscience for Duplin County and surrounding counties on all of these issues. He is also the co-producer of a documentary entitled Swine Country, and is currently working with Johns Hopkins University on a number of research projects. But his work really began years ago with Dr. Steve Wing, who is credited with much of the information that we have now about the impact of living near and around these industrial hog operations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Will first, and then we'll start the conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sherry. And it is a pleasure to be with everyone tonight. I want to thank the North Carolina Council of Churches for hosting this event, and thank all those in attendance for joining today to learn more about an important environmental justice issue in North Carolina. And so you don't have to stare at me for the entire time that I'm talking. I've prepared a brief slide deck that I hope will both provide some key historical context, introduce the issue of biogas, and ultimately flag some recent developments and opportunities for engagement and next steps. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Can I get a thumbs up that that's shared from someone on the panel? Awesome, great. Well, again, my name is Will Hendrick. I'm an environmental justice advocate with the North Carolina Conservation Network. Before I move on, I want to make sure that everyone on the call understands what I mean when I talk about environmental justice, because it's really the intersection of environmental law and civil rights law. And environmental justice contemplates the meaningful involvement and the fair treatment of all people in the development and the implementation and the enforcement of environmental laws, decisions, and policies. And I'm here tonight and I'm engaged on this issue because this is an environmental justice concern. But before I begin talking about biogas, I think it's really important to introduce the subject of industrial hog operations and waste management at those facilities. Because really, biogas is building on that broken foundation that Devon and others in impacted communities have been fighting for years to change. And so I want to make sure that I provide that introduction to the topic before specifically diving into the subject of biogas. I should also flag that perhaps the most relevant of my work experience to this presentation tonight was the almost 4 years that I spent with Waterkeeper Alliance managing a campaign in North Carolina focused on combating the adverse impacts of industrial animal agriculture. And so I feel that by virtue of that work, alongside and shoulder to shoulder with Devon and so many other community members, that I'm prepared to offer that context, but I really look forward to the elaboration and that lived experience that only comes from someone like Devon or Sherry who lives near these facilities. With that said, the first thing that I want to do is talk a little bit about the Lagoon and Smithfield system, because it is really important that nobody on this call conflates the bucolic pastoral image of the American Gothic painting or your mom and pop farm with what is going on and what we're discussing. We're talking about industrial animal agriculture, and this is not your grandpa's farming. In fact, many don't call this farming at all. It's factory production. But regardless, the key here is that as a result of considerable industry consolidation and concentration in North Carolina, we are experiencing some of the adverse consequences that I'll discuss today. And to really underscore that change in pork production, I think it's notable that in 1982, not all that long ago, and for the UNC fans in attendance, a really great basketball season. But in 1982, there were 11,000, roughly 11,000 swine farms in North Carolina. And there were commercial pork operations in all but one of the state's 100 counties. That was before the significant consolidation and vertical integration that changed the landscape, literally and metaphorically, in North Carolina. By 1997, there were fewer than 3,000 hog operations in the state. The industry was primarily saying to the participants, you got to get big or you got to get out. And as a result of that shift, facilities became concentrated heavily around some of the infrastructure to bring the pigs to market. Most notably, some of the slaughterhouses in Eastern North Carolina, operated by Murphy Brown, which later would become a subsidiary and now operates as an entity within Smithfield Foods. Important to note, and I'll elaborate a little bit in a moment, that industry is now heavily concentrated in southeastern North Carolina in the coastal plain, and also heavily concentrated in communities of color and low income. But before I talk about that, I just want to make sure that we hone in on waste management. There are a whole bunch of things I could talk about in the context of these concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, if you ever hear that term of art. But really, the harm that we're focusing on today is the harm that stems from improper waste management. So to give you an idea of what these facilities look like, first of all, the animals are raised in these large confinement barns. You can see the image on the top left of your screen. They reside on slatted floors through which their excrement falls and is collected beneath them. It is periodically then flushed out into these earthen lagoons for storage. These are not, your lagoons from tropical vacation destinations. These are just lagoons of waste, many the size of multiple football fields, and they are for waste storage. Again, the waste beneath the animals in the confinement barns is periodically flushed into these impoundments for storage. Eventually, as it accumulates, it has to be disposed of. Primarily, that is done through land application. That liquid content is sprayed onto fields, hence the name spray field as a component of this system. Occasionally, but far less frequently, solids or sludge management is also required, because that heavier material sinks to the bottom of that lagoon. It too needs to be managed in order for the lagoon to function as designed. That too is ultimately land applied. This is land applied on the theory that it is a valuable fertilizer for the receiving crops. Unfortunately, it is often over applied beyond the crop needs and creates significant harms to environmental quality and public health, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I want to flag before I move from this slide that this system is authorized under state water quality permits. It is not governed currently by federal permits. The action occurs at our North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the adverse impacts of this lagoon and spray field system. These are extremely well documented, both by scientists here at the University of North Carolina, at NC State, but also through citizen science, such as that conducted by REACH and its members in collaboration with Johns Hopkins University and others. The point being, there is no debate that the following impacts result from this system of waste management. So I've got them listed on the slide. I'll elaborate briefly. Surface water impacts and groundwater impacts are what I focused on the most while I was at Waterkeeper Alliance, because the mission of that organization was honed in on water quality. So some examples, the same waste stream that is stored in those lagoons and is land applied onto those spray fields, unfortunately, enters into our rivers, lakes, and streams, both through runoff in the event of precipitation, sometimes through direct discharge, although that's illegal, and often through percolation into groundwater resources that sit beneath those spray fields. This is one point where I want to draw your attention back to that fact that I mentioned about this industry concentrating in the coastal plain. The groundwater on which so many North Carolinians, especially in rural parts of our state, rely for their drinking water is closer to the surface in the coastal plain than in many other parts of the state. So the groundwater resources are even more vulnerable to this particular system of waste management. But I would be remiss if I stopped at water quality impacts. Well, I should say, we're talking about things like nitrogen and phosphorus, so nutrient pollution, which can create algal blooms, some of which create cyanotoxins that are harmful to human health. We're also talking about nitrate pollution of drinking water, which is associated with a litany of adverse health outcomes, including most notably methylglobamine. Sorry, methylglobamine. I'm not even trying to say that word again. It's blue baby syndrome. That's why the scientists came up with a really fancy word, and then the common folks like me had to come up with something else to refer to that disease as. But it poses significant adverse health outcomes, especially to children in utero. In addition to the water quality impacts, there are a host of adverse impacts associated with the air emissions from these facilities. One thing I should note, that permit that DEQ issues does nothing. to regulate air emissions. It does not even attempt to do so. Air emissions include methane, which we'll talk about in a minute, because that's what they're using to generate energy on these biogas facilities. But it also includes hydrogen sulfide, which is incredibly harmful to human health. Ammonia, which is also very harmful to human health, and which is a precursor to particulate matter pollution. Particulate matter pollution is one of the leading causes of mortalities due to air emissions. And there was actually a report published earlier this year in spring of 2021, talking about how every single year emissions from agricultural operations contribute to additional annual mortalities nearing 100 every year in Duplin County alone. Again, odor is an adverse impact that was alluded to in Susan's introduction. Anyone who's been near one of these facilities, especially on a warm day with a breeze flowing, will absolutely attest to the impact that has on their olfactory nerves, but also just their the lived experience, their quality of life. There are countless stories of folks unwilling to even invite their friends and family over to the house because of the embarrassment of that odor and the inability to predict when it'll arise, because it's often a product of waste management and land application close to their residence. There are also impacts to soil due to the accumulation of some of the content of that waste that is land applied. And really important to note that all of these impacts that I just mentioned are associated with a host of adverse health consequences, too often overlooked by environmental regulators focusing on the natural resources, but never overlooked by the impacted communities whose lives are often literally cut short or who are suffering due to the impacts of this industry. And again, the quality of life as a result of these impacts and others is suppressed because of proximate residence to this system of waste management. Just to give you a few statistics, there are in North Carolina 288 of these lagoons within a half a mile of a church. There are 136 within a half a mile of a public water well. There are 170 that are still within our 100-year floodplain. And there are 37 that are within a half a mile of the school. These are daily adversely impacting the lives of North Carolinians. And too often, those impacts are to the most vulnerable among us, or as Matthew 25 may say, the least of these. And I want to talk a little bit about disparate and cumulative impacts. So, as I mentioned, I'm in this because of its environmental justice implications. This matters to me because of the disproportionate impact on communities of color and low income. There was a reference earlier to the work that Dr. Steve Wing at UNC Chapel Hill has done for years, including with communities such as Devon. He and one of his colleagues produced in 2014 a study of the disparity of the impact of this industry. And I'll not recite those statistics here, but you can see on the slide that this industry has a disproportionate adverse impact on African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans living near these operations. I also would be remiss if I did not mention the subject of cumulative impacts, because it's not enough, it's not bad enough that these facilities are so disproportionately located near these vulnerable North Carolinians, but too often other sources of pollution are co-located in those same communities. And the burdens of the multiple polluters in the vicinity of one's home is the real cumulative total of their burden and the lived experience. I have a couple of images here to try to underscore what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the cumulative impacts. So on the top, you see this image with the sort of golden and blue dots on it. This is a screenshot from the North Carolina DEQ's community mapping system, which ostensibly shows a community member all of the sources of pollution in his or her neighborhood. What it fails to include, however, are industrial poultry operations. Now, I know we're going to talk about swine, and I'm not getting off track, but I could not speak to cumulative impacts borne by the neighbors of swine operations without also drawing your attention to the large and expanding poultry industry in our state. And this bottom image is actually a result of some nonprofit organizations who did mapping of those poultry operations. The same golden dots on the top, those are swine operations permitted by the state and tracked in their community mapping system. In the bottom picture, those same facilities are depicted in red dots. But all of those purplish magenta dots are poultry operations, and none of them show up in that community mapping tool. Moreover, in recent years, that poultry industry has expanded extremely rapidly. Between 2012 and 2019, there was a 36% increase in the number of chickens and turkeys produced in this state. But what I want to flag, again, to underscore the environmental justice implications here, is that increase was driven by an astounding expansion in Robeson, Duplin, and Sampson County. Counties where already we see a large amount of pork production, and where 57% of the residents are, as self-identified in the 2010 census, non-white North Carolinians. So the cumulative impacts of multiple industries are disproportionately adversely impacting the most vulnerable among us. Now, maybe wondering, well, Will, it's 2021, and surely this isn't new. And if folks have been working on this for decades, surely something has occurred. So I'm going to briefly talk about some of those historical developments, because the truth is, our leaders have been aware of this harm for decades. In 1995, then Governor Hunt commissioned, with his partners in the General Assembly, commissioned a Blue Ribbon Study Commission on agricultural waste. That commission produced a scathing report talking about the failure of then existing regulations to address this industry. And most importantly, as a result of their work, a statute was enacted years and years ago that specified critical improvements in waste management that were necessary going forward as additional facilities were constructed. However, they did not at that time require retrofitting of then existing operations, which is why the problem persists today. This harmful system was allowed to be continually operated despite the harm that stemmed from it. And now I should say, this action didn't occur just because advocates pushed for it. There were a number of motivating developments, most notably a 25 million gallon spill of hog waste into the New River from a facility in the New Basin, the Ocean View Farm spill, for those in the know. But just the following year, Hurricane Bertha triggered an additional 1.8 million gallon hog waste spill. And then in 1999, Hurricane Floyd hit eastern North Carolina, devastating the coastal plain and causing all sorts of adverse impacts. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, our leaders tried to respond. However, in the last 5 years, the reminder has been often repeated that we still have progress to make. We still have room to improve. In 2014, when the general permit that governs these operations was reissued by the Department of Environmental Quality, that gave rise to a Title VI complaint brought by the Rural Empowerment Association of Community Health, the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, and Waterkeeper Alliance under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Like I said, EJ, environmental justice, sits at that intersection between environmental law and civil rights law, non-discrimination law. And the allegation in that context was that the reissuance of this permit for this broken system violated non-discrimination obligations that are borne by the state's Department of Environmental Quality as a recipient of federal funding. The EPA investigated that complaint, ultimately expressed grave concern about the disproportionate adverse impacts on communities of color, and as a result of subsequent negotiation, made some minor improvements to its general permit. Unfortunately, many of those changes have subsequently been challenged by the North Carolina Farm Bureau and are currently the subject of ongoing litigation. So the protection contemplated in those negotiations still is not being realized in impacted communities. Around that same time, we've had in the last 5 years, 1,000-year storms, and storms that the meteorologists predict won't happen but once 1,000 years. We've got a couple in the last half decade. I don't need y'all are, if you've been around North Carolina, you're familiar with the adverse impacts of Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence. They led to widespread flooding, multiple structural failures of these waste lagoons, the introduction of untold volumes of untreated waste into our rivers, lakes, and streams, and our communities. Also, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, public health researchers have been just hammering home, adding to the large body of research talking about the adverse health impacts. I mentioned the air quality study that was just published this last spring. In 2018, a large study was published in the North Carolina Medical Journal talking about how if you live close to one of these facilities, that proximate residence is correlated with a host of adverse health outcomes. Too many to count, really. Just a lot of respiratory illnesses, heart problems, all sorts of issues. And in the last 5 years, when North Carolinians living near these facilities sued to assert their right to the peaceful and useful enjoyment of their own property, these basic property rights, they sued under nuisance law. Nuisance law is meant to preserve and protect that use and enjoyment of one's property and prevent your neighbor from depriving you of that property right. And consistently, the plaintiffs, the neighbors, won in court. I think it's interesting that those 5 cases, those were selected in sequence by the plaintiffs and the defendants. They were litigated by extremely competent lawyers and ultimately in federal court with reams of evidence. The evidence was evaluated by 5 different juries. The plaintiffs got to pick their first case, the best case, then the defendants got to pick their best case, and the plaintiffs got to pick their second best case, defendants their second best case. 5 times, 5 juries, 5 different facilities, one Lagoon and Smithfield system. And every single time the jury considered the evidence, they found that this industry was violating the property rights of these North Carolinians. Millions of dollars were awarded in compensatory and punitive damages. Federal appeals court affirmed the liability. Ultimately, many other North Carolinians settled with Smithfield because their similarly situated reality was the subject of the same legal theory that had been successfully asserted by those North Carolinians. Unfortunately, in response to that successful litigation, our General Assembly has actually stripped North Carolina law of many of those nuisance protections. Similarly situated North Carolinians cannot get into court under the same legal theory, even if they are experiencing the same harm from the same industry. Now, we're to talk about biogas, so I swear I'm getting there, I promise. I want to talk a little bit about some of the developments in swine waste management that have occurred since that late 90s sort of awakening, where we realized this Lagoon and Smithfield system is harmful, should not be allowed to persist, right? So very, very notable. In 2000, then Attorney General Mike Easley entered into an agreement with a number of the key industry players, most notably Smithfield Foods, but also Carroll Foods, some of the other pork producing entities in the state. And this, what is called the Smithfield Agreement, obligated, and it's still in force, it obligates the industry to invest in and ultimately install technology on those existing operations, the ones that weren't the subject of the moratorium, that statute I mentioned about new facilities, if it met certain statutory criteria. It addressed those 5 harms that I mentioned were enacted and referenced in statute, and were found to be economically feasible. More about that in a moment. Also, in 2007, our taxpayer dollars went to try to evaluate and invest in better waste management. There was a lagoon conversion program that was created by the General Assembly to try to invest in technology that met those performance criteria, that managed waste in a way that avoided those known harms. In 2009, multiple technologies developed under that Smithfield Agreement were evaluated. Multiple technologies were found to meet the performance criteria. In other words, reduce that harm that is being disproportionately borne by communities of color and low income. The only hang up is that none were deemed economically feasible. In the years since, a lot has changed in terms of the market dynamics, in terms of technology available, but there is still not been a single facility where by operation of that Smithfield agreement, that superior technology has been installed. Fast forward to 2018, Smithfield Foods, the dominant pork producing entity in North Carolina, formed a joint venture with Dominion Energy, one of the big power producers in the state. They called that joint venture Align Renewable Natural Gas, or Align RNG. And they committed to installing anaerobic digesters as part of biogas projects throughout Eastern North Carolina. In fact, they committed to do so throughout 85% of their finishing farm facilities in North Carolina, Virginia, and in Utah. So they decided to invest heavily in biogas technology. Now, talk a little bit about what is biogas. Now, big picture. The Lagoon and Smithfield system, by virtue of the industry's choice to store this waste in a liquid form in those lagoons, it generates methane. I want to underscore that is not a natural product of swine waste decomposition. That is not an effect of waste management back in 20, 30, 40 years ago when it was simply tilled into land as fertilizer. It is a direct result of the decision to store the waste in the way that the industry chose in the late 90s to do so after that industry consolidation. Methane is a significant greenhouse gas, and it can be burned to generate energy. And so biogas is essentially is a term that is used to describe efforts to capture the methane that is generated in these lagoons and convert it into energy. One thing I will flag is that part of what led us down this road was an attempt to wean the state off of fossil fuels. In 2007, the General Assembly enacted what is called the Renewable Energy and Efficiency Portfolio Standard. We call it REPS. And so you may have heard of that before. And because of the politically powerful at the time utilities desire to avoid those requirements to wean off of fossil fuels, advocates made a deal with agriculture. And as a result, because of they're another significantly politically powerful entity, as a result, that renewable energy and efficiency portfolio standard actually requires a small, but still requires some energy production from swine waste. Also requires a different amount of energy to be generated from poultry waste. And that's just an important part of the legal background to the story of biogas. Now, I have to pause for a minute to make sure that everybody in the audience understands that biogas can be produced in a whole bunch of different ways. In fact, some of those facilities and technologies that were developed under the Smithfield Agreement involved biogas, but not in the way that the industry is pursuing it now. Some would you capture that methane to, for instance, there was a facility in Zebulon that would then use it to power a greenhouse where he grew his tomatoes. Another operation in Yadkinville, you capture that gas, powered a generator on site, helped to address the on-site energy demands of his operation. Another facility in Lillington is actually connected to a microgrid to try to help power local communities. That is not how Smithfield and Dominion, as this Align RNG joint venture, is approaching biogas. Instead, the dominant means of biogas production today, and likely in the future, because of that announcement and joint venture of those two powerful entities, is directed biogas. So in those kinds of projects, they cover the lagoon. Again, they got to capture that methane. But then instead of powering on-farm operations, they ship that gas to a utility-owned conditioning facility, right? Because Dominion had to have a little bit of involvement, right? Now they send that gas through these new pipelines, often, crossing, private property. They process it at that central utility-owned facility. and then they inject that gas into existing natural gas infrastructure. Now, a few concerns to just flag and elaborate if folks have questions. Problems with this approach to swine waste management. First and foremost, it does not meet the critical performance standards that were established years and years ago in statute, that were referenced in that Smithfield agreement. It does not address those 5 well-researched, well-documented harms that are still being borne by communities of color and low income in North Carolina. Now, instead, they'll note, but it addresses this other harm, contributions of greenhouse gases, which are real, but again, are the result of waste management decisions made by this industry. And unfortunately, it can actually make some of the impacts of the Lagoon and Smithfield system worse. For instance, instead of some of that waste off-gassing in ammonia in the form of ammonia concentrates a lot of that nitrogen in the effluent, and which is still land applied. So it's increasing that risk of surface water pollution. It's increasing that risk of groundwater pollution because it's a more concentrated waste stream that is still sprayed onto those same fields, still close to communities of color and low income. That's going to be operated at the same facilities where the disparate impact has already been well documented. Also, there's been a considerable lack of transparency in the development of these kinds of projects. I will note that before the Farm Bill of 2021, which I'll speak to in a second, a few facilities have been permitted. The Department of Environmental Quality repeatedly sought additional information about the nature of those operations, and they were repeatedly rebuffed by the industry. Thumb their nose at the regulators and refused to provide critical information, for instance, about the full scope of this project. Now, what I've got here is a reference to Align RNG's first big project that they've announced right there on Highway 24 between where Sherry lives and between where Devon lives. They called this the Grady Road project. And that Grady Road project, it was designed to collect gas from at least 19 different industrial hog operations. However, when the regulators were asking, hey, can you identify those 19 facilities so that we can reach out to the potentially impacted communities, so we can evaluate the cumulative impacts borne by them, so we can understand the project? It's just said, no, you got what you need to issue the permit to the specific facilities that are seeking authorization to construct this technology, and you have to issue it. And ultimately they did. So lack of transparency is real. And again, the process and the technology itself is not being designed to benefit host communities. And it's not being designed to listen to or respond to the concerns of those impacted. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, this year, the General Assembly took steps to grease the skids for this change in swine waste management. And in Section 11 of the North Carolina Farm Act of 2021, which is now law, unfortunately, was not vetoed. And I've got the section law citation there for you, for those interested. It created a whole host of additional problems because instead of allowing the industry to at least evaluate individual facilities on their merit, based on the evaluation of individual communities, based on the realities about other polluting industries in those specific communities, the General Assembly decided that, you know what, a one size fits all permit is how we're going to approach this. And if that wasn't bad enough, part of the direct result of moving from individual permits to general permits is the inherent reduction of opportunities for community input. Instead of the community members around a given facility being apprised of this development and afforded an opportunity to speak to the agency and express their concerns, anybody who's concerned about biogas is going to have to participate in the one-time process around the generation of this general permit. And that is problem enough. But if that wasn't bad enough, it also, this same legislation did another host of harmful things. First of all, it says to the agency, well, other than a few terms about the operation of this new digester, all of the other terms of the permit, the same ones that were the subject of DEQ's claims about grave concern about discriminatory impact, we want to keep those in place. And if that wasn't bad enough, they weakened long-standing siting restrictions. In fact, in 1996, the Swine Farm Siting Act was enacted, and its goal was to prevent lagoons, these big waste impoundments, from being constructed near vulnerable receptacles, near property lines, near rivers, lakes, and streams, near schools, churches, etc. One provision in this North Carolina Farm Act allowed for the relaxation of those siting restrictions. So literally, lagoons are being constructed closer to neighboring properties as a result of the pursuit of biogas technology and the allowance of this General Assembly earlier this year. Not only that, they eliminated the financial incentive that until this summer was on the books, affording a tax break to swine operators who invested in waste management technology that met those 5 criteria, that solved those 5 harms. Well, they realized that this biogas technology isn't solving those 5 harms, but they wanted to, again, allow for its pursuit. And so they removed that incentive for the development of superior waste management technology. Now, there have been a couple of recent developments, and then I'll turn it over to our other esteemed presenters that I just wanted to flag. I mentioned that a couple of facilities were issued individual permits. And although an individual permitting process is preferable to a general permit in terms of the opportunities for community involvement, there is a difference between the meaningful involvement of community members and the fair treatment of community members. And substantively, those permits left a great deal wanting. And as a result, the permits issued to the first four facilities feeding into that Grady Road project were challenged. So too was the permit for that utility-owned conditioning facility on Grady Road. Moreover, because of the demonstrable discriminatory impact of those biogas facilities, the Southern Environmental Law Center filed on behalf of the Duplin County branch of the NAACP and the Poor People's Campaign a Title VI complaint, saying to EPA, look, this is another agency action by the same agency that you investigated in 2000 as a result of that 2014 complaint, and they're making it worse. That is pending right now with EPA, where former DEQ Secretary Michael Regan sits at the top of the chain of command. In addition, as was alluded to earlier, and as I hope some of y'all got to witness in person last Tuesday, the Environmental Justice and Equity Advisory Board, which exists to advise the DEQ Secretary on environmental justice issues, has engaged on this subject. In fact, twice. The EJEAB issued first a formal advisory letter talking about procedural protections, how to ensure the meaningful involvement of community members. But then last week, they doubled down, revisited the issue, and unanimously agreed to issue advice regarding substantive protections, permit terms that can better protect North Carolinians who live near these biogas facilities. And I want to flag real quickly some of the next steps. The General Assembly said to DEQ, you've got to develop this general permit, this one-size-fits-all permit. And they gave them until next July to do it. The Department of Environmental Quality is already talking about how it's going to go about developing that permit. We already know that it will involve at least a stakeholder process, and by operational law as required, a public comment period where written comments can be submitted, and multiple public hearings will be held about this development. So there are going to be on the horizon, although we do not know the dates certain yet, multiple opportunities for interested advocates, community members, congregations, and organizations to weigh in on this topic. Let your voice be heard, lift up the voices of impacted communities, and demand better. And we will be working on, at every front, at every turn, to maximize the protection for residents who live near these facilities. And I look forward to working with you on that and in that fight. I am going to just flag my contact information here. I'll leave it up briefly, but I'm happy for it to be shared with any participants after tonight. And with that, Sherry, I'm going to turn it back over to you and look forward to answering questions as they arise.
Thanks, Will. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Devon. Devon, do you want to give an introductory statement, talk about yourself a little bit more, and then we can get into some question and answer.
Yes, thank you, Sherry, and thank you to the North Carolina Council of Churches for, inviting me, this evening. As I sit here this evening, you notice I'm wearing a hat. And I say that because, as co-founder and now the executive director of REACH, with all the work that we're doing and has been doing for many years, it seems like there's, for several years now, I've been wearing many hats, whether we're doing community organizing, partnering with John Hopkins or UNC Chapel Hill with research projects, or as I was doing earlier today, and that's why I'm wearing a kind of beat up looking hat, working in the garden. So, with myself and born and raised here in Duplin County, as it was stated earlier, you partnered with Dr. Steve Wing, 2004, the first research project I'd ever been a part of. But I want to begin by saying, first of all, when we begin to talk about biogas in the communities, like where I live, I would like to say I didn't choose this work. This work more or less chose me. And at the same time, just for the contents of tonight, I don't want to just talk to people, but I want us to talk to each other, have some dialogue, so we can better understand what we're dealing with in our communities and just what biogas will do to our communities. I also want to say that I've been on the record on many occasions stating that I believe that contract growers is caught between a rock and a hard place. And, some, use the term family farms, but at the same time, these facilities are factories that is, spread out all across our communities. I don't see them as family farms anymore. But again, the contract grower, many of them is caught between a rock and a hard place. When we and I say REACH, when REACH first began to partner with universities or researchers to address some of these issues, we didn't, it didn't take me long to realize that we could use research as a tool to kind of engage communities, enlighten and inform communities. With that being said, it didn't take us long to also realize that the Lagoon and Smithfield system that the industry is currently using is a broken system. There's not much talked about the sludge, and the dead boxes. That's, the dead boxes, dead trucks that is hauling those dead animals through our communities. But that's also a concern. So again, that's one of the reasons why, I don't like to just talk to individuals, just talk. I like for people to be a little bit more engaged and ask questions. Then we begin to address the issues of climate change. And as Will stated, greenhouse gases, we've learned, is one of the major contributors of climate change. And with the hurricanes, and the other major storms that often hit our communities or hit our coastline, with the flooding. So these, if there's a lagoon that's breached and is flooded into our creeks and streams, then that's another concern that we in the community have to deal with. We also, with that, we begin to talk about cumulative impacts and what that does to us, with whether it's the swine barns or the poultry barns, or now we're looking at these biogas or methane digesters. So at some point, we are asking our regulators, when is enough enough? So again, to the North Carolina Council of Churches, my question or my concern here is, how can we engage in some type of conversation to really shed some light on what we're living with in these communities and to initiate some change? So at this point, again, I've been on the tractor today. I've been working in my garden. So now, I'm open to for questions, thoughts, and I'll kind of just throw this back to Sherry and let you facilitate this for the rest of the evening.
Thanks, Devon, and thanks, Will. And as I've listened to you all talk, I have a number of questions that I'd like to follow up on. Devon, I'd like to ask you why the work of Steve Wing, the early work of Steve Wing, was so important and how that informs the work that you're doing now and what we all can learn from that work.
Well, Sherry, when I first met Steve Wing, and at the same time, same day, I met Naima Muhammad. And with that first research study, I knew that there were some issues. I knew that that these farms had a negative impact, on our livelihood. I grew up hunting and fishing, here in Duplin County. And I can remember the first time I went to one of my favorite fishing holes and cast a line and began to catch fish that had sores and boils on it. I had no clue what that was. So again, with Dr. Steve Wing, when we began to engage in research, collecting data, that's when I first, got a taste of what we're dealing with. And I wasn't satisfied with just myself knowing. I wanted as many people in our communities to find out or learn as much as we could, so we could learn how to better protect ourselves. So again, like I stated a moment ago, I learned that research would be a powerful tool.
Great. Will, I'm going to go back to you real quickly. You talked a little bit about the economic feasibility requirement of the technology. And as we talked about biogas down this road, particularly over the last couple of years, one of the things we keep hearing is the focus from the industry on the economic feasibility of the technology. Can you talk a little bit about the false idea that this technology may actually be economically feasible, but the industry is trying to say that it is not economically feasible?
Yeah, sure. And one of the things I will flag is that the same entity, Smithfield Foods, is pursuing biogas in very different ways that are more protective of communities in other states, for instance, in Missouri. So it's difficult for me to accept an argument that it is impossible to do in North Carolina what is currently being done elsewhere to manage swine waste by the same company. The other thing that I want to make sure I clarify is that although we talk about superior technology as described by those 5 performance criteria, there's also separate North Carolina law that explicitly states, and I'm just going to quote it, all permit decisions shall require that the practicable waste treatment and disposal alternative with the least adverse impact on the environment be utilized. So practicable is where the industry would argue that economic feasibility piece comes in. But I think it's important that we don't exclusively look at the Smithfield Agreement as the driver of the needed technological change. And as we have seen this industry invest in and install better technology to manage swine waste elsewhere, I think that only strengthens our argument that they should be doing so here. The last thing I'll say is that the industry has found a way to profit off of this waste stream. And the revenue that will be generated through, for instance, the sale of renewable energy credits, or is and should be put toward investment in better technology, right? You can afford to do better and you're making more money off of a system that's entrenching harm disproportionately borne by the most vulnerable among us. So again, you've proven it's possible to do better. You should be doing so here. And it's clear that you can do, if you are so inclined, what you must do to protect North Carolinians.
Thanks, Will. Devon, we often hear that the digesters will reduce odor from the lagoon that is covered. Is that good enough?
No, it's not, because just the digester, as it stands, trying to reduce odor, it still don't meet the criteria that, for the ESTs. On top of that, there is already a digester here in Duplin County, Optima KV. So if you're talking about reducing odors, try driving past Optima KV, and then, tell me if you really think it reduces odors. I think that in some cases, the industry is good at painting a pretty picture. And that's one of the reasons why we often ask people to come down and spend some time in our communities and see for yourself. Just like when they were spraying the waste on these fields, which is called spray fields. Come down and ride around and get a sniff for yourself. Again, with the dead trucks, there's very little talked about that. So if you ever is in our communities and you meet a dead truck, or a dead truck passes by, or you end up driving behind one, no one will have to tell you what that is.
Can you explain what that is?
Well, a dead truck is simply a truck that's resemble a trash pickup truck that collects those dead animals. And of course, it's been transferred to a rendering plant. Again, that render plant is also located here in Duplin County. So again, when you begin to talk about odors, and at the same time, it makes me think more about the cumulative impacts. What else are we gonna have to deal with? The render plant's gonna be here. You got dead chickens, dead turkeys, dead hogs. Now digester. What's next? So at some point, we need help, and hopefully, the North Carolina Council of Churches, with their audience, can see fit to, again, partner with us, ask us questions, come see, and help us address these issues.
Will, can you talk a little bit more about some of the other examples of cumulative impacts in communities and why it's so important to really understand what that means in terms of the decisions around permits?
Sure. Just to be candid, the cumulative impacts, as the name suggests, are the impacts of multiple polluting operations in the same community that are cumulatively impacting the same North Carolinian. And oftentimes, sadly, the less desirable actions that occur in our society are concentrated in the communities that have access to the least amount of political power to resist the construction and operation of those harmful industries. And so too often we see the same communities where, say, industrial hog operations are concentrated, suffering from other polluting industries that have come into their communities and set up shop, oftentimes at the invitation of a county economic developer, under the theory that somehow the jobs will paper over the harm that will result. And so, for instance, you could have, well, as in the case of Sampson County, you could have a landfill near a same community member who lives near a hog operation, who also lives next door to a poultry operation, who also lives down the street from a wood pellet facility, and suffers the adverse impacts of not one of those facilities on a given day, but multiple. And so it's critical that when the state is contemplating whether or not it's meeting its obligations to prevent discriminatory impact, that it doesn't look at one impact at a time, one permit at a time, and say, and pretend as though just this operation is impacting the neighbor. When in reality, sometimes the same regulatory agency has authorized multiple operations in that same community that have cumulative impacts borne by the same neighbors. And so it's a term that gets used a lot, but it does not get put into practice enough by our regulators.
One of the listeners has raised a question, and it is an interesting question. Somehow, as you talked about this, it's clear that the true cost of pork is not reflected in what actually happens with the pork or with the production and then the delivery and eating of the pork. Can you see any way that this could be addressed to incorporate more of the cost of raising the pork and the cost in health to local communities? Devon, and then I'll go to Will on that.
You know, one thing I've learned about big business when it comes to cost of the pork in the stores, big business always gonna find a way to, you know, to make as much as they can, you know, just plainly speaking. If they increase the cost of a pork chop by 1 cent a pound, the average person wouldn't really notice it. But if you look at the millions of the many pounds of pork that they're producing and putting on the shelves, so again, I think that's another way that the industry would, you know, just paint over things, just like it is with the nuisance lawsuit. I mean, the type of money that that it cost them, you know, millions of dollars. Those first 5 cases, the consumers is the one that's gonna take care of that. So, and even when it comes to the superior technologies, the one thing I will say, again, going back to your contract growers, these smaller growers, I'll say again, I believe they caught between a rock and a hard place. I think there's many of them that just can't afford to put that technology, you know, the ESTs, environmental superior technology systems on their farms. So somehow, I do believe that the industry, the integrator themselves, should step in and help. They're the one that's, you know, looking closer at the bottom line and walking away with the billions after they spend their millions in these lawsuits.
Yep, Devon nailed it. I mean, it's ultimately going to require action by what we call the integrators, the guys at the top of this system, Smithfield Foods, for instance, internalizing the cost of waste management associated with the production of the product that they bring to market. Right now, they are externalizing the cost of pork production onto communities like Devon, and they are therefore able to profit at the same price point because they externalize those waste management costs, and they impose those on the contract grower that Devon was just speaking to. One of the policy solutions that could address this, has long been sought by advocates, is integrator liability, co-permitting. Make the company that's name shows up on the bacon at the store responsible for the waste generated by the animal that was slaughtered to produce that bacon. But unless and until the industry has more skin in the game and is responsible for managing that waste instead of pushing that responsibility on one of its contract growers, then the economic feasibility argument will continue, and the true cost will be difficult to incorporate into the realities of the market. And the other, you know, truth is they could probably afford to continue profiting, make just a little bit less, and invest some of that into communities. But unless they got an illegal incentive to do so because they're required to manage that waste, they'll continue trying to avoid it. And apparently, whenever folks like North Carolinians in those nuisance cases find a way to get around all those legal hurdles and assert some liability against Smithfield, instead of doing better, they'll just go to their friends in the legislature and get the law changed.
Mhm.
So again, I think that's the key, as Devon said, is making the integrators responsible for the cost of waste management.
I want to go back to the question of legislation in a few minutes, but since we've talked about the impacted communities around these facilities, let's talk a little bit about the workers. What is the cost to the workers? Devon, I know you all have done some research looking at pig tobacco and what happens there. Can you talk a little bit about impact on the workers? Are they the same people that live in the communities, or are they different?
Again, you know, the workers, yes, live in the communities, work on these farms. And it saddens me because I think in 2018, when Hurricane, what was it, Florence, Matthew, that, you know, hit our coast, that the industry, you know, went public and announced that they were airlifting workers to the farm to take care of those animals. So you gonna airlift a worker to the farm? That means regardless of how bad it get there, he can't leave. So again, you know, just like I've said, the contract growers are caught between a rock and a hard place. Those workers, you know, in some cases don't have much of a choice. If that's their livelihood and they chose to work for this industry, because they, you know, in many cases they live in these communities, they don't have to travel as far. So yes, they bear even a greater burden, even when it comes to some of the negative health impacts, because not only are they working in an environment that could cause some adverse effects on their health, but then they leave work and they go home, they're living in that same thing.
Thanks for that. Let's talk, it's clear that there needs to be something done legislatively. And just like with everything else, it takes a village to make that change. Clearly, these CAFOs are located in communities that have the least political clout, who are generally taken advantage of. What can be done through the faith community to help with that outreach to elected officials to get them to understand their role in making sure that every citizen in North Carolina has a healthy life and quality of life? Will, I'll give that one to you first and then back to Devon.
Well, I would encourage members of the faith community to join us in advocating for the least of these. Speaking up on behalf of the vulnerable North Carolinians who live near these operations. I think it's too often the case that advocates expect the representatives of a particular community to actually voice that community's concerns in the General Assembly. But as you can both attest, unfortunately, the representatives of Duplin and Sampson County are very, very tied to this industry. But the good news is, no matter how close they are to that industry, how powerful they are, what committees they sit on, may mean they've got a little bit more power. But at the end of the day, they just got one vote. And there are other members of the General Assembly who represent other constituents, including other congregations and other churches, who could be encouraged to speak on behalf of the North Carolinians in southeastern North Carolina, whose representatives do not have their best interests at heart. Because it's going to take legislative action to change some of these policies that I flagged. There's a little bit that can be done at the executive branch, and I would encourage everyone listening to be engaged when DEQ begins this process of biogas general permitting, because that is a place where we can try to maximize protection to the extent authorized. But the extent authorized is dictated by the General Assembly. And that's where we need more champions. And we need champions in the mountains, just like we need them on the coast, because the champions in the coastal plain are championing the interests of the industry, not of the impacted communities. Now, we could talk about policy changes all day. I mean, we could talk about reversing the retreat from some of the protective policies that were put in place in the late 90s, you know, reinstating the Swine Farm Siting Act protection, reinstating the requirement when you're modifying a facility to install that superior technology, reinstating those tax incentives for superior technology, investing in the now dormant funds to remove these facilities from the 100-year floodplain, creating integrated liability, moving individual permit. I mean, the list goes on and on. The problem is not that the solutions aren't clear. The problem is there's insufficient political will to implement them. And all North Carolinians have an elected representative and an elected senator. And the more representatives and senators we get on our side, the better our prospects will be for changing those laws as needed. And so I would encourage you to talk to the folks who represent you in hopes that they will better protect people in Devon's community, because they can't do it alone. Because that one vote can be bad or good, but it's still just one vote. And we need majorities in both chambers.
Thanks, Will. Devon, I'm going to ask you that question slightly differently. We know from working in Sampson and Duplin County that oftentimes the folks who are most impacted and affected are afraid to speak up. How can faith communities work with folks in our communities to give them or to empower them to be able to speak up and tell their story and try to create political change?
Well, one thing, you know, I would say to the North Carolina Council of Churches that you could be a voice to the voiceless, meaning the people that live in these communities. You know, the one thing that really upsets me that with the North Carolina General Assembly, that's the place where the Council of Churches can begin to voice their concern or speak in behalf of the people that live in these communities. I think back on when the North Carolina General Assembly drafted and passed a bill to prevent you know, anyone that feels that that this industry has upset their quality of life, they can no longer sue for a nuisance. And the thing that really gets me about that is, you know, we got a North Carolina General Assembly that drafted and passed a bill to protect another country's interests, because Smithfield is owned by Chinese, you know, so I have not been able to, you know, to figure this out yet. Why is the North Carolina General Assembly drafting and passing this type of bill? You know, and here I am now, you know, and many others that still live in these communities and don't have a desire to move anywhere else, you know, and, you know, you just can't sue. I mean, and because of this company we call it Smithfield, but we know that it's owned by WH Group, you know, with a Chinese-owned company. So you got the North Carolina General Assembly that drafted and passed those bills. So yes, the North Carolina Council of Churches talk to those legislators and ask them why and how. And if there's a way that they can reverse or change, you know, amend some of these bills that's set in place to continue to harm us.
Thanks for that, Devon. You mentioned something that I don't think that a lot of people are aware of. They see Smithfield, but they don't see WH Group. So can the two of you talk a little bit more about how that has happened and what that impact has been like? And I'll start with you, Devon.
Well, it's easy to pass the blame on someone else or protect someone else sometimes. And if I may, I'll just throw it out there and talk about COVID-19, where it was so easy to blame China or blame someone else. But one thing we do know for sure, that Smithfield is owned by WH Group. And to shed a little light on that, when the attorneys from that first presented the nuisance cases to the federal courts, it was made clear that they could use WH Group. And I think it was stated that there would be a monetary recovery if, in fact, that there was some damages discovered. So again, it's no secret to us that Smithfield is owned by WH Group. So we can say Smithfield all we want to. Smithfield name, is on the marquee, but it's owned by WH Group.
Will, do you have anything to add to that? Any thoughts on how to interact that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just note, I guess it was in 2013 that WH Group purchased Smithfield at a purchase price nearing $5 billion that valued the company at approximately $7 billion. And yet they still claim it's economically infeasible to invest in superior waste management technology. And that's about all I'll say about that. If you want to learn more about that, there was a Rolling Stone article published not long ago that talked about why is China treating North Carolina like a third world country. But I think that the point about the ownership is indisputable. That actually resulted in even less transparency about the company's operations, because no longer publicly traded. And again, I think that the point about ownership, nobody can debate. And I think it was appropriate that Devon addressed that in a way that is not xenophobic, that is not anti, China, but is rather pro North Carolina, because that's what we're talking about here. And that's the way that we address that, showing love for all of our neighbors, including the neighbors of hog operations here in North Carolina.
We are about 8 minutes out from the time we had. Susan, can we take a couple more questions? Okay. Just as a wrap up from both of you, if you had a perfect world, what would it look like, Devon?
Oh, wow. I don't know. But I would say this, because I do believe in research and technologies, that in a perfect world, because we do need farmers, when the industry, was having their growers to put those signs in their yard and saying, no farms, no food, I'm saying you're right. I agree. Because we do need these farms. I still eat pork, so in a perfect world, even though with the ESTs and they deem that they're not economically feasible, in a perfect world, I would be saying, put those systems on the ground and let's see. And if there's something that's not quite right about it, then work the kinks out of it. I guess it's like that with anything else that man has made. If there's a little problem with it, they go back to the drawing board and they figure it out. That's technology. That's the world that we live in now. So in a perfect world, yeah, let's try those systems and see if it works. the ESTs, not just the methane digester that's standing alone.
Okay. Thanks, Devon. Will?
That's a real tough question. And so I'll just answer, since we're talking with the North Carolina Council of Churches, and say that I think that one component of a perfect world would be a world in which we all loved and showed respect for the creator and creation and loved our neighbors as ourselves. Treated others like we'd want to be treated. Followed that golden rule, that versions of which are articulated in every major faith tradition that I'm aware of. That to me is really at the heart of this, is the lack of compassion and empathy. And in a perfect world, we'd all have more of both, myself included, because also a sinner, right? But that's what a perfect world would look like, in my view. It's one where we all loved our neighbor as ourselves.
Thank you both, Will and Devon. It's been a great conversation. I'm going to plug, I know Susanna will talk about it too, or Susan, for your next event. But one of our ministers from Sampson County, Reverend Jimmy Melvin, will be on your next panel. And we have had a phenomenal experience with Reverend Melvin showing up. And as a result, we have ministers calling him to find out what they can do in Sampson County. And so there is a way for pastors, for parishioners to get involved in this. And you actually lead the way for so many other people. And with that, I'm going to close and turn it back over to Susan. Thank you so much for the opportunity to facilitate.
Thank you. This was tremendous. It exceeded my hopes and dreams for this webinar. And you all were so great. And I thank you so much for participating. I think everybody again who came, and as Sherry was saying, we are going to have a next webinar session on November 2nd at the same time, 7 to 8:30. And we will have a different panel. We'll be talking about some solutions to the problems that this hog waste biogas presents, as well as getting some more voices of community members. And I would not only invite all of you who've come tonight to come back, but please tell your friends and neighbors, but also any community members that are affected by this issue. I really invite you to come and to get in touch with me if you want to say something. We would love to hear your voices. I was half jokingly saying that I support clean energy, but honestly now I'm supporting clean bacon. And I think we all should, and we need to get involved in how to make it a better situation. If you don't already subscribe to the North Carolina Council of Churches weekly e-newsletter, please go to www.ncchurches.org to sign up, and be sure to learn about all the important educational and advocacy opportunities for faith communities in North Carolina. And I'm going to now turn it back to Susanna to close us out.
Well, thank you, Susan, and thank you, Sherry, and thank you, Devon, and thank you, Will. I am a changed person after having witnessed and listened, and have a lot of learning to do. I am going to watch this recording. I hope all of you that have participated on Facebook Live will share this with your community. I heard the call from Devon for, at least to me, to organize our congregational network to do some community visits, some community listening tours. I'm very, very grateful to the North Carolina Conservation Network. We will be looking to you to help guide us through this as we move forward. Many of you know that I have been in this position as director of NCIPL for over 10 years now, and have been working on climate related issues, and somehow big ag and agricultural, industrial agriculture I have not had the capacity to engage directly in the work. And clearly the time is now, beyond time. And again, Susan, I want to thank you for your leadership and coming to NCIPL and the Council of Churches and saying, I want to volunteer, I want to give, I want to be a part of education and outreach. And so thank you for that. And we have a lot of work to do. So I'd like to close with words written by Sarah Ogletree, our former program coordinator, who is now the director of Creation Care Alliance of Western North Carolina. And Will, I heard your call to the mountains as well, and to Charlotte and to the Piedmont and to the Sandhills. We're all in this together. We are all one in North Carolina, and we must love our neighbors and our brothers and sisters all across the state. So let us hear these words as prayer. We do this work because we know that we cannot love our neighbors or ourselves without loving and protecting the air we breathe, the water we drink, and ground in which our food is grown. We know that this is an issue of justice, that our Black and Brown siblings feel the impacts of climate and environmental justice and the realities of environmental degradation first and worst. This is a systemic reality. And so this work that we do is movement work for justice and compassion and the creation of a sustainable and more beautiful world. May it be so. Thank you, everyone. We hope you will share this Facebook Live event on your social media pages, and we will post the YouTube link of the recording as soon as it is ready. Please stay safe and strong. And we will gather again together on November 2nd to hear from more members of the community. Thanks again to all our presenters tonight. Here we go. Forward together.